All right, so this is a presentation on Chapter 5. If you have the slide presentations downloaded from Blackboard, you'll notice that this chapter is a little bit shorter than what you may have downloaded already. I've kind of pared this down a bit and just focused on what you will be tested on. All right, so chapter 5 is about evaluating a work of art. And your textbook narrows it down to three basic principles, three different methods of evaluating a work of art, which it defines as theories. The focus on this chapter is really to focus on what we learn about the work of art and how these three theories sort of apply to it. Right. So, evaluating works of art. To compare these two works of art from the textbook, we have two pieces to compare and contrast them. They are both works of art by female artists. They are both paintings, and they're basically portraits, possibly self-portraits in the case of the one on the right. But whenever it comes to how they're different, well, one is clearly much more realistic than the other. The one on the left is done by a professional artist of the Baroque era, and the one on the right is done by what might be classified as an outsider artist. You can also see that the one on the left is in the National Gallery of London, whereas the one on the right is displayed in the so-called Museum of Bad Art, which I think might be a little bit unfair because obviously one is a bit more realistic than the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the one on the right is bad. But that did give me an idea of a homework option, which you can find on Blackboard in the discussions category. Right, so the Museum of Bad Art is a real museum. It's in Massachusetts, not far from Boston, and it displays works of art that were mostly found in thrift stores, abandoned, sometimes dug out of the trash, sometimes donated by the artists or their families. And if you peruse their online catalog, you'll actually find some pretty interesting and intriguing works of art. And in many cases, I don't think they're necessarily bad. They might not be skillful, but I think they could still be very meaningful and profound. And that's the point of this exercise, to pick a work of art from this museum and write a sort of defense about it, why you think it's not really all that bad, and writing an interpretation on it. What do you think this piece is trying to say? You can read more in the instructions on Blackboard. I would like to, though, call your attention to the fact that the museum will give titles and sort of sarcastic comments on the works of art, and those should really be ignored when writing about them because, in most cases, what's known about the work of art is basically non existent. But yeah, it's clear that this museum operates on the principle that good art is realistic, photorealistic, and bad art is abstract and made by non-professional artists. And this brings me back to that discussion on my abstractometer and how realistic works of art and abstract works of art shouldn't necessarily be classified as good or bad. Right, so in a normal class environment, there would be three works of art up for discussion, and the three theories, formal, contextual, and expressive, would be applied to all three, revealing what we learn about these works of art the more we start to evaluate and critique them. However, in the interest of brevity, I am going to focus on this one here. This is the image that will be on the test. This is what you need to know and take notes on. The other two works of art are just there to supplement the information a little bit, but since they are not on the test, I have chosen to omit them from the presentation. So let's talk test. Right, so this is a work of art by the artist Titian, and this, as I said, is the one that's going to be featured on the test. The test question is written as a multiple choice matching question, and it's phrased a little bit awkwardly. It's phrased as, imagine you are writing an essay on this painting, and you write about blah, 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 such and such information. Which method of evaluation are you using? And you match the method of evaluation with the information that we learn about it. So, as you take notes, make sure that you categorize them into these 3 different theories and just keep note of what we learn as we apply them. Okay, first up, a formal analysis of a work of art. This involves looking at it from an art historical standpoint and also from a composition. Whenever you guys learn more about art history, you'll notice that it's all about styles of art. So, if you were to evaluate a work of art, you would focus on when the work of art was made. Was it made in the early modern, late medieval? Was it made after World War II? What style is the work of art? And how is it similar to other works of art in this style? Who might have influenced the artist? Who trained the artist? How is this work of art similar to or different from other works of art from that time? It again requires a bit of a knowledge of art history. And then it also involves, though, something that you wouldn't necessarily have to have an art historical background, the visual elements, thinking about what we learn in chapters 3 and 4 about color and composition and line and focal point. So let's apply these theories to this work of art. Okay, so take a look at the label information. The artist, Titian, not Titan, by the way, and the title of the piece is Pietà, which means lamentation or sadness. You can see the other information, but let's go ahead and look at these bullet points. When was this work of art made? 1576, late 16th century, and the style is late Renaissance. So imagine you were writing a paper on Titian's Pietà, and you apply the formal theories. You compare it to other works of the late Renaissance and how it follows and breaks from tradition. So, looking at the subject of the piece, this is a biblical subject, a pietà. This means, as I said, lamentation or sadness. It's a work of art that depicts Christ, the deceased Christ, being cradled by his mother, Mary, and surrounded by his mourners. So, to apply the formal theories here, you would look at other works of art that also show a pietà scene and talk about how it's similar to and different from other pietàs. But you'd also analyze the composition. So look at things like the size of the piece. As we can see here, 11 feet 6 inches by 12 feet 9 inches. This is a very large painting. It's actually the largest painting Titian ever made. And fun fact, you see this line here? That's not a problem with the image. There's a seam in the actual canvas. This painting is so large, it actually consists of a few pieces of canvas stitched together. And this is essentially the seam blocking together these pieces of canvas. Right, so visual elements. Talk about color scheme. In this case, I would use the vocab term low intensity colors. It's mostly browns. And even whenever we do have colors like red, blue, and yellow, they're rather low intensity variations on those hues. It's a rather dark painting. You'd also look at the visual elements of like implied shape. In this case, the implied shape is a triangle, but it's unusual in that it's sort of an off-balance triangle. Usually, Renaissance artists like their works of art centered. In this case, there's a lot of energy, to use a vocab term, a lot of directional force sort of sweeping off to the left here. So it breaks from tradition in that sense. So that's a formal analysis, looking at the style, looking at the composition, and how the visual elements are arranged. It's frankly kind of an uninteresting way to evaluate a work of art, but it will form part of your final paper. Step 2 of your paper is analyzing the composition. Also, talking about style, this can actually form one of your vocab terms where you talk about the style of a work of art. All right, so to show just a few other little bits of just kind of, I think this is interesting information. This shows you the scale of the piece. Those of you who have redeemed your textbook have an option where you can click on an icon and it shows you how big the painting is compared to the viewers. This is a picture of it in its housing museum. It's in the Accademia in Venice. You can see it over here on the right next to the equally large piece by Paolo Veronesi, which we'll learn about in chapter 17. Again, a very, very large painting. Also, talking about a contextual, or I'm sorry, a formal analysis involves who's who. Now, you definitely recognize Jesus, Mary, Mother of Christ, and you may have recognized Mary Magdalene, but this figure here, kneeling, is a little bit unusual. Who is this person? And to apply the formal theories would involve looking at other works of art that depict the Pietà. So again, Mary, Mother of Christ, Mary Magdalene, and typically the man present is St. John, St. John the Evangelist, but he's usually depicted as a very young man, usually beardless and sort of with long hair. Sometimes people will mistake him actually for a woman. In this case, though, it's not St. John. He's far too old to be St. John. So, what old man would be present at the crucifixion? And in class, we might have a fun discussion. Those of you who grew up going to Sunday school might know your Bible trivia. You could suggest Joseph, the sort of Christmas story Joseph, the stepfather of Christ, but he's not typically at crucifixion and Pietà scenes. He's actually not even mentioned in the Bible after a certain point. It's thought that Joseph would have died before Jesus grew up and began his ministry. The only old men present at the crucifixion story in the Passion narrative could be Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, the people who bore Jesus' body away and placed him in the tomb. But again, having him at the Pietà is kind of unusual. People who know their saints and know their Renaissance art can perhaps identify him as Saint Jerome. However, in terms of a biblical narrative, Jerome is someone who comes much later, would not be present at the crucifixion at all, and he's basically here to serve as a sort of a patron saint for a work of art, which is sometimes common in Pietà and crucifixion scenes. And by the way, in case all that kind of flew over your head, that isn't going to be on the test. This is your horrible art history teacher flying off into a tangent about her favorite subject. And actually, to continue down Tangent Town, the statue on the left is kind of interesting. It's a figure with two tablets and a staff. You'd recognize him as Moses. But there's another way that art historians could recognize Moses. Looky here. He has horns. So if you ever go into a church and you see a statue or a painting of an oldish man with a white beard carrying a couple of tablets and having shines of light coming out of his head, that's Moses. And the reason why works of art show Moses as having beams of light or horns coming off of his head comes from an odd translation of the Bible whenever it was translated from Hebrew into Latin, describing Moses's face as being radiant or having horns of light. Whenever it was translated into Latin, they translated it as his face was horned with light to describe the effect of God's power shining off of him. And one thing led to another, and artists took to representing Moses as having actual horns poking up from his head. Isn't that fun? But again, not necessarily on the test. I just thought it was cool. All right, so again, that's formal analysis, looking at the composition and the style. The next methods of evaluation require doing a little bit of research and reading. So next, contextual. The key word is context, placing a work of art in its historical context. So in this case, you would look at the date when it was made, and you would also have to look up where the art was made, and then start Googling, start researching what was happening in that culture, in that country at that time. Was there a war? Was there a depression? What religion was common? What was the politics of the time? And does this work of art reflect that cultural environment? Well, let's see how it applies here. Okay, so if we were to apply the contextual theories to Titian's Pietà, you would see what was happening in the location is Venice, Italy, 1576. What was happening in Venice, Italy in 1576? And the answer is the plague was happening. There was a severe outbreak of the plague. Thousands of people were dying. 1/3 of the city of Venice died of plague-related illness in the year 1576. And this work of art, this painting, was made in that cultural environment. And does this painting reflect that kind of experience? I would argue yes. It's a painting about death, about grieving. This is a work of art in which people are mourning the death of Christ. And as we pointed out already, the colors are dark and somber. It's a very sad, almost angry painting. And I think it does definitely reflect that sickly, sad environment of the 1570s in Venice. So again, to phrase this in terms of the what's it going to look like on the test, imagine you were writing a paper on Titian's Pietà, and you look up the history of Venice 1576. You learn about the plague. You argue that this painting is a reflection of those people at that time. Question: which method of evaluation are you using? Answer: contextual theories, because you're placing the art in its historical context. And yeah, speaking of a time whenever plague was running rampant, people were dying of the plague, and quarantines were being forced on the people, well, that probably sounds familiar to you guys. And this made me think, of course, of everyone's experience in 2020 and what a rotten year it was. And it made me think whenever I started updating these slide presentations after quarantine, applying the contextual methods to works of art, well, what would 2020 look like if it was a painting? So this is another homework option. You'll find this in the art project section. What was your 2020, or in some cases people have chosen to show 2021 as a work of art? And once again, your work of art is not being evaluated on how good or detailed it is. It can be simple stick figures, it can be totally abstract, it can be literal, it can be symbolic, and like all art projects, it does involve a written element. So in this case, this person made this, I think, charming little comic strip about being stuck at home and being surrounded by everything needing her attention. And she included a written paragraph describing what she drew and how it expressed her 2020. A lot of students talked about how prom was canceled or how graduation was canceled and the struggles of suddenly having to adjust to an all online learning environment. So these are kind of more literal takes on 2020. Some people chose to use symbols, a dumpster fire, a case of toilet paper, the virus itself, and everything sort of crushing the person underneath. And this person wrote about the symbols that he used, a skeleton representing death, but the hope that he tried to find within it, represented by the butterflies. And these works of art here on the right are totally non-representational, using colors and brushstrokes and lines to express their anxieties. So again, you create the work of art, but you also have to explain your work of art in the written elements. You can learn more, of course, on Blackboard under Art Projects. Right, so that's context. Looking at the work of art in its historical context. What was happening in this culture at that time? Next up, expressive theories. So back on day 2 of the entire class, I asked, why do people make works of art? And usually the first thing people offer is, oh, people make art to express themselves. And if we think to chapter 2, the purposes and functions of art, self-expression is a big one. It's also a very popular take on the purposes and functions art projects. So, if you want to understand a painting, well, you need to know who made it, don't you? And that's the expressive theory. So in this method of evaluation, you focus entirely on the artist. You look them up, look up their information. Who made this? What was this person like? What was important to the artist? How does this work of art, this painting, this sculpture, how does it reflect the artist's life and experiences? Perhaps more specifically at that time. Was this work of art made after a divorce? Was this work of art made whenever one of their best friends died? What was happening in that artist's life at the time? Or more broadly, how does this work of art communicate the artist's interests or concerns? Was that person a feminist, or were they someone who was trying to make a comment on a particular issue? But again, it focuses on the artist and how the artist expresses themselves, hence expressive theories. So, imagine you're writing a paper on Titian's Pietà. Using the expressive method of evaluation, you focus entirely on the person who made it. Titian. Who was Titian? What kind of a person was he? What was he interested in? How does this work of art express Titian as an artist? Or perhaps more specifically, as an artist at that time. So you guys may have never heard of Titian before, but rest assured he was a very famous artist in his time. Very well regarded, very professional. But if you look up the artist's information, so take a look. This was made in 1576. And this is actually the year that the artist died. He was a very old man whenever he passed away. We don't know Titian's actual birth date, but he would have been 87 or 88 whenever he died in 1576. This is one of the last paintings he ever made, and it's also, as I said, the largest. So something I didn't really point out back in the contextual theory is how loose the painting is, how sort of brushy it is, unusual for the time. But considering that this is a work of art painted by an old man, that sort of brushiness, that blurriness is something that we do see in paintings made by very elderly artists, which again, Titian definitely was in 1576, 87 or 88 years old. His eyesight was failing, his hand wasn't as steady, and his paintings tend to become very brushy. And I included these self-portraits by the artist made at later points in his life, and you might be able to guess by now why I did that. So come back to this guy here in the red and how I mentioned that in terms of the narrative of a Pietà, it doesn't quite make sense. As I said, the person is dressed as Saint Jerome, but the figure himself is actually an inserted self-portrait of Titian. That's him in this painting. And knowing that kind of gives me a little bit of a chill. This man, this artist, it's almost like he crawled inside the painting to talk to Jesus. And there's another little detail to point out. At the base of the statue over here, there's a little painting within the painting. It's kind of hard to make out, and my slides aren't very high quality, but on this painting within a painting, we can see that it's a sort of a votive offering. It shows two people kneeling and praying to a Pietà scene, and this is thought to represent Titian again. And the young man here is Titian's son, Orazio, and this was made by an artist who actually was grieving the death of his son. Whenever you research the artist's life, you realize that this artist's son died of the plague in 1576. And knowing that and looking at the painting, it does give me a little bit of a chill, that sort of death's close presence. And Titian, as I said, would himself die in 1576. I mentioned this is the last painting that Titian made. And actually, he never even finished it. There's a little inscription at the bottom of the painting that tells us that Titian left this painting incomplete, and Palma reverently, respectively finished it. So it's thought that Titian's assistant, Palma Giovanni, did the finishing touches on the piece. And art historians will sometimes argue that the little angel here was actually a late addition made by Palma. But again, the expressive theories, how are they applied here? Whenever you write about this piece, you would talk about the presence of the old man. You talk about the fact that this is a self-portrait, and you argue that this painting represents an old man grieving the loss of his son and preparing for death. That is how the expressive method of evaluation is used. So, using those three theories, formal, contextual, expressive, really reveals a lot of very interesting information about this really intriguing painting. I have to say it's a favorite of mine and one that kind of gives me a bit of a chill whenever I look at it. And that's all because I didn't just look at the painting and evaluate whether or not it was realistic. I did a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, and as I said, this is what is really necessary to fully understand a work of art. All right, so thank you for listening in to my presentation here. If you have any questions about this chapter or the test, just let me know. Admittedly, this is kind of a tricky chapter whenever it comes to how the test looks, but hopefully this all makes sense for you. All right, thank you.